Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to the next All Out Leadership Podcast. We're continuing in the life of David. Now, today we're going to start a section that I'm very excited about because this is so relatable to everybody that has a pulse. We all encounter this. Whether you're a leader or not a leader, you're going to encounter this. 5 enemies that will be on the path to success. Now, we often think of David as the giant killer. We think the greatest battle that David fought was as a young boy killing Goliath. And that was a big battle, but that's not the biggest battle that we're going to face in our life, is the enemy on the outside, the enemy inside of Satan's camp, so to speak. What we find is that David had 5 enemies that ultimately were within his own camp, that were part of his own people. The people who should have been for him were actually sometimes his own greatest enemies. And there's 5 of them that we'll all often encounter. And we're going to unpack these from the life of David. And what we're going to see is Jesus often encountered some of these same challenges. His greatest battles weren't necessarily with the Romans. Pontius Pilate even said, "I find no fault in this man." The people that he battled were the very people that he came to love, to die for, and to save. And then Jesus said this: "A servant is not above his master." So if Jesus was betrayed, if Jesus ran into problems with those that were closest to him, know this: we will too. Joseph ran into this problem with his family. He tried to share his vision. His father didn't really believe in him and actually rebuked him. And then his brothers betrayed him because they were jealous. And he ran into the people who should have been for him actually were the people who were against him the most. It's how we respond when we encounter these different enemies that determine whether we break down or we break through, whether we fall apart or we go on to that next level. The key really comes down to trusting God, guarding our heart, and responding in love. I'm going to say that again, that you just trust God, that God is greater, that God is for you, and if He be for you, it doesn't matter who or what's against you, and you guard your heart from unforgiveness. The Bible tells us, "Let no root of bitterness grow up and defile many." What happens is when we allow unforgiveness in our heart, it defiles our view, and we can't see anything good, and it pollutes other people around us. And then, as Jesus says, love your enemies. We just simply have to respond in love. And we can do this when we understand Romans 8:28, that all things are working together for our good, even our own failures at times. When we put those into the hands of God, even He can turn those around and use them for our good. When we look at Jesus, the very people that betrayed Him, as horrible as it was, as heartbreaking as it probably would have been to experience, the Father allowed it, and it actually was used by the Father to help put Jesus exactly into the Father's perfect will and fulfill His plan for His life. It was Judas's betrayal and the Jewish leader's betrayal of Jesus that led him ultimately to his destination, which was the cross, to die for the sins of the world. It was people's betraying him that actually fulfilled the Father's plan. Joseph, it was the same thing. It was horrible that he was betrayed and sold by his brothers, that he was betrayed by Potiphar's wife and thrown into prison, and then he was forgotten in prison for a season of time. All those enemies against him actually were used to help fulfill the plan that God had for his life. So when you know that nobody holds your destiny but God and you can respond trusting God. You can respond with guarding your heart, and you can respond in love, because no man, no woman holds your destiny but God. And how you react determines your success. So I'm going to go ahead and just give you a quick overview of the 5 enemies, and then in our next podcast, we're going to start unpacking these, because we're going to learn from David a couple things. We're going to learn how to respond, because David responded well, many times, then we're also going to learn how not to respond, because David made some mistakes that created more mistakes, that created a cycle of mistakes when he responded incorrectly. And hey, I've been there and done that, and you probably have too. So we're actually going to find some great practical things and some good encouragement on both accounts. So 5 enemies. Number 1, you're always going to have an enemy at some point in your life that's above you, meaning some authority figure of some kind. It might have been a parent, a grandparent, it might be a boss, it might be a church leader, but somewhere in your life, you're going to encounter an authority figure, somebody that would be above you, that is not for you, doesn't believe in you, that maybe is circumventing you, undermining you. And this was Saul to David. And that's where we're going to start. But let me go ahead and give you the next 4 as a teaser as where we're going. The next, you're always going to have an enemy below you, somebody that maybe technically you're above. And we see that with David and his son Absalom, who betrayed him, who tried to throw a coup and overthrow his father and take his kingdom from him. And so we all have an Absalom in our life somewhere, somebody that maybe you poured into, maybe you discipled them, maybe you led them to Christ, maybe you did a bunch of nice things for them. Maybe it was someone that you were a boss over and you helped invest into them and they got promoted, and then all of a sudden, somewhere along the way, they betray you, they gossip about you, they stab you in the back. We are all going to have an Absalom. Then you're often going to have somebody that's beside you that will betray you, and that's Ahithophel. And so David had a trusted advisor that he actually called a friend. He saw him as a peer. In fact, in his psalm, when he was processing with God the betrayal and the pain from Ahithophel and Absalom, he said, if it was, just an enemy, I could have bore it, but it was you, a close friend. We went into the house of God together. We broke bread together. We took counsel together. So it was this person who was seated beside David who betrayed him because he sided with Absalom during the coup. And we're going to get into some of the details of that and why and how we can respond to that. And so you're going to have somebody beside you that was a peer, that was a trusted friend that you poured into, that you were close to, and you're going to get betrayed somewhere in life and hurt there. And then also along your path, you're going to have a guy or a girl named Shishimi. David, when he was fleeing from Absalom, this guy named Shishimi came out, and the Bible says he was throwing dirt and rocks. We do that all the time. It's called gossip. It's called Facebook, Twitter, social media, where we just throw gossip and dirt at people. And I mean, like, dirt is a whole industry, billion-dollar industry. What's the latest dirt on so-and-so? You're going to have somebody along your path that's throwing dirt at you, throwing rocks of criticism at you. It's going to happen. And then you're also going to encounter this 5th one, and that is in the sanctuary of God. If you are a Christian and you attend church, you're going to find somebody in the sanctuary of God that is going to stab you and hurt you. David fled from Saul to a sanctuary where he was meeting with the priests, and he was looking for food and some resources. And there was a man there named Doeg who later told King Saul that David had come and been helped by these priests. And King Saul goes and wipes them out. But David should have been in a safe place. It was God's sanctuary. It was God's leaders. It was God's house. It should have been safe, but it wasn't, because there was a Doeg. Know this, there is always a Doeg lurking around in your church somewhere that will sell you out for gain at just the right opportunity. And again, we're all going to encounter these 5 enemies. It's how we respond that determines how we succeed. You can't control what happens to you. You can only control how you respond to it. And it's your response that determines your success. Because again, nobody but God holds your destiny. David overcame all 5 enemies. Not one of these enemies stopped the plan of God for their life. Oh, there were some speed bumps, but David floored it and got some really sweet air as he just soared above his circumstances. We're also going to see that David contributed to creating some of these enemies and how we can avoid it. And he not only contributed, he actually put gasoline on the fire with some of his actions. So we're going to learn some things to avoid as well. Look forward to seeing you next week as we start to unpack enemy number 1, above named Saul.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all out